while Blakely was Richard and Christian's home, the dominant figure there certainly was his mother, the widowed Jane Charlotte Blackburn Washington, who had been given by her husband's will of 1832 ownership of Mount Vernon and Blakely, with the power to give or leave it to any of their children that she chose to. Indeed, she owned her husband's entire estate. When her older son married in 1843, she set him up at Mount Vernon, and when her younger son married in 1844, she set him up at Blakely. But she continued to live back and forth between the two places. And it's really unclear to me to what extent either of the boys actually owned these properties during her widowhood after they were married, or whether they really only received them by her will of 1855. It seems puzzling that there were no soldiers from Blakely or Mount Vernon going into the Confederate Army, except for Colonel John, who was killed in 1861, and his brother Richard, who was after that sent home by General Lee to take care of his family responsibilities, and who was too old really to be in the ranks and felt he was insufficiently inexperienced to be an officer, having no military experience or background. Of course, he was a famous squirrel shot and would have been a great sharpshooter, and indeed has credit for killing from some great distance one of John Brown's men in Harper's Ferry at the time of the John Brown raid. Of course, the reason that they didn't send any more soldiers to the Army was that the oldest male in the Mount Vernon set of children was, I think, 7 years old at the beginning of the war. And in what we'll call the Blakely family, Richard's family, he had one son who was 17, and the next son was born in 1852, so was only 9 years old when the war began. The 17-year-old son was a hunchback, very small man, bent way over, and family always said he'd been dropped when he was a baby. Of course, we know now that it's obvious he really had Pott's disease, which is tuberculosis of the spine, and that's the cause of most young hunchbacks that you see. Of course, you don't see them anymore. Anyway, he was obviously not qualified to join the Army, but he did manage to get himself imprisoned by the Yankees. Nonetheless, he was herding some cattle from one field to another down one of the roads here when they came along and picked him up, captured him, put him in a prisoner of war prison in Washington. His mother's mother, who had been a Philadelphia woman and had all sorts of northern connections, her name was Clemson, Louisa Clemson, just got on the train, went down to Washington, and went in and talked to Mr. Lincoln about this situation. And Abraham Lincoln gave her a note, which I think the family still has someplace, saying, let the boy stay in Washington with his relatives as long as he goes to school and stays out of trouble. And so he stayed with some Lee cousins named Miller, I think, in Washington. For I always thought it was for the rest of the war, which was only a year or so. But I think I've later seen evidence that he somehow got down to Richmond and got some sort of a job at the age of 17 as a clerk down there helping out, shall we say, in the war effort. Well, I may be wrong about that. But anyway, Uncle John was not qualified, and the only other males in that family group, those two family groups, the oldest was born in 1852 and was 13 at the end of the war. The many daughters of the Mount Vernon family and one daughter of the Blakely family did marry Confederate veterans after the war. Perhaps the most prominent, best remembered of those veterans was Colonel Roger Preston Chew, who married Louisa Washington, the oldest of the 7 Mount Vernon children. And he had been a colonel of the horse artillery of the Army of Northern Virginia, and is certainly the best remembered as a military figure of the various sons-in-law.